Please stand for our invocation. O light of the great central sun, beloved Alpha and Omega, beloved Helios and Vesta, our Father, Mother God, intensify thy light, thine eye all-seeing through us. Focus now, through our hearts and souls and minds, the pure vision of thy reality and the understanding of what is real and what is unreal here below. We call for the dividing of the way of light and darkness, the edification of our souls. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten us. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten us. And let the cosmic cross of white fire watch between us and thee, O God, as we make our way as pilgrims on the path of light. In the name of our Savior Jesus Christ, we call unto Lord Maitreya, Gautama Buddha, and Sanat Kumara. We call for the victory of the God flame here and now, for the victory of the age and the overcoming of all of the portents of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Let them be consumed, let them be transmuted, O God. In the name I am that I am. Amen. How are you all this evening? It's very nice to see you. I'm glad you could come for me to be able to deliver my message to you, which I would have liked to have given during the conference, but we simply ran out of time. It's a very timely message on matters that are happening right now. And so, in the love of Saint Germain and his action for the world, I'd like to invite you to sing number 680. I ask you to make your own prayers and calls for the blessing of our nation. we love you. America, we love you. America, we love you. And our love is great enough to hold you eternally victorious in the light. Thank you. Please be seated. You're welcome to take out notebooks and take notes. As I was watching ABC's nightly propaganda on December 28th, I was strongly moved by the Lord to deliver to you this message. And so that is where we begin. On December 28th, 1990, ABC's Nightline examined chaos in the Soviet Union. Forrest Sawyer observed that Mikhail Gorbachev is under fire and that the Red Army might pose an internal threat to the Soviet Union. Asked Sawyer, with 1991 around the corner, will the Soviet Union survive? Jim Laurie's opening segment looked at the crisis in the Soviet military. We're going to take a look at Jim Laurie's piece.
The Soviet Union, a nation in chaos. Mikhail Gorbachev, a president under fire. And there are concerns the once proud Red Army may be a new threat from within. Now, with 1991 around the corner, will the Soviet Union survive?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from New York with the latest on the Gulf crisis, Forrest Sawyer.
In just 2 weeks, 17 more U.S. ships will be in position near the Persian Gulf. They set out today from ports in Virginia, New York City, and Florida. 16,000 sailors and Marines are on board. By contrast, the Soviet Union has virtually no military presence in the region, only a destroyer and an anti-submarine vessel there to protect Soviet citizens. There are no Soviet soldiers among the multinational force. Today's threat to the Soviet military is not in the Gulf, but inside its own borders. Reformers demand dramatic restructuring, dismantling much of the great Russian war machine. Anti-reformists say the army must be strengthened and used to restore order. Once completely loyal to the Communist Party, officers are now uncertain just how to protect their country. Tonight, the turmoil in the Soviet Union, the challenge from the right, and what the future may hold. First, Moscow correspondent Jim Laurie on the crisis in the military.
Afghanistan, it hurts my soul, the words of a popular Russian song. The Soviet-Afghan war, which ended early last year, still haunts the nation. It has generated anti-war sentiments much like those which grew out of America's experience in Vietnam. Ivan and his wartime buddies Igor and Yura served in Afghanistan for nearly 2 years. More than 20,000 Soviet soldiers died as a result of the 9-year war there. They try to visit their fallen comrades at least once a month at the Mitenskoye Cemetery outside Moscow.
The people are very much against war. We paid a very high price for Afghanistan. No one wants to get into that again.
It's a psychological bomb. People don't trust the government anymore and don't want it to use their sons as soldiers.
The proud Soviet military machine, goose-stepping troops, officers laden with medals, once the Red Army, veterans of the Great Patriotic War. Today, military morale has reached an all-time low.
Morale in the army is like the morale in the society. People are absolutely disorientated. The values that they used to believe in, the ideals they used to believe in, ideals of socialism and communism, whatever that means, have no value anymore.
The morale problem has called into question the reliability of Soviet soldiers in deployments overseas. In East Germany, Soviet troops faced with going home have been deserting at an alarming rate. At home, this is the Military Counseling Center in Moscow. set up to hear the complaints of young enlisted men and their parents. Many soldiers, like 19-year-old Andrei Zavarov, come here just after they have deserted their units. In their interview, they are asked to produce evidence.
I couldn't take it anymore. They beat us up. They even kill young men in the army. I had to leave, to tell someone about these conditions.
Diedovshchina, the young men call it. Hazing, brutal treatment of new conscripts by older enlisted men and officers. Soviet reports say more than 2,000 men have died in the past year from such beatings or by suicide. Disillusionment has deepened as the military has been pressed into service on farms to help bring in crops. At the same time, the meals the men get here are dismal.
In Czechoslovakia, we got fruits and vegetables. Here, all we get is tea, bread, soup, and barley. How can you eat that every day?
More opposition to forced military service has developed as nationalist movements around the country have grown. Draft card burnings in the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia. They've been coupled with demands that service in the military be limited to republics where the young draftees live. The Soviet military situation is further complicated by the Muslim factor. There are 50 to 60 million Islamic people in the Soviet Union. They are the nation's fastest growing ethnic group. And while most Soviet army officers are Russian, 38% of all enlisted men are Central Asian of Islamic heritage.
If there is a war and deaths occur, these could trigger an explosive reaction here. In Afghanistan, many of our Muslim boys defected to the enemy. If soldiers were sent to the Gulf, they might also defect.
Moscow has further reasons to be nervous about its Muslim population and how it might be affected by a Middle East war. The Central Asians are among the poorest of this nation's people. These Uzbeki men can find no work. They fill their days gambling and waiting. Economically deprived, this is a population that is angry, alienated, in search of new, more radical solutions to its problems.
It's very alienated from the central government, and it is increasingly prone to accepting an Islamic ideology which is violent in its means and very radical in its ideology. A U.S.-led invasion of an Islamic state could in fact be the event that sets this tinderbox ablaze.
The people of Soviet Central Asia, in fact, have far more in common with the people of Iraq than their rulers in Moscow. The Iraqi embassy here claims many Soviet Muslims have actually volunteered to serve in the Iraqi army. While their numbers are no doubt small, the young, like this Azerbaijani student, think radical thoughts.
As a Muslim and a man, I want to fight this threat and danger with arms and defend our honor. All the artificial many nations created by imperialism must perish, and Muslims should be united.
Apart from such extremism, the bottom line is that many here see Soviet military involvement in the Gulf as political and economic suicide for the Gorbachev government. Given its shattered economy, unruly ethnic groups, a foreign war is the last thing the Soviet Union wants or needs. This is Jim Laurie for Nightline in Moscow.
What message are we supposed to get from Laurie's story? His summary statement is made in the context of Soviet participation in the Persian Gulf. A foreign war is the last thing the Soviet Union wants or needs. But Laurie is trying to convey the impression that the Soviet Union cannot easily use its army outside of its own borders, not in the Persian Gulf or anywhere else. In other words, the West has nothing to worry about. Let's examine the underpinnings of his argument. Laurie says that morale in the Red Army has reached an all-time low, and that anti-war sentiments have emerged in the wake of the Soviet-Afghan War. Why the drop in morale? Laurie cited bad food, hazing or physical abuse of conscripts by their officers, the fact that the army has to harvest crops. Laurie points out other problems. Muslims make up a large percentage of the conscripts, which he says acts as a check on Soviet foreign policy in the Middle East. There is 60s-style opposition to forced military service in the Soviet republics. The picture Laurie paints of the Red Army is hardly threatening, but Laurie's report is misleading for a number of reasons. In his portrayal of the Soviet Army as low in morale, weak, and beset with problems, he is helping the Soviets to fulfill Sun Tzu's maxim, "When strong, appear weak." Sun Tzu said, "All warfare is based on deception. Therefore, when capable, feign incapacity. When active, inactivity. Offer the enemy a bait to lure him. Feign disorder and strike him. Pretend inferiority and encourage his arrogance. When he is united, divide him. Attack where he is unprepared. Sally out when he does not expect you." The problems Laurie has unveiled in the Soviet military are not new, and they don't affect the Soviets' ability to fight a war. The Soviet philosophy for treating their conscripts has always been hard in peace, easy in war. As William Baxter, author of Soviet Airland Battle Tactics, puts it, "Life for Soviet draftees is hard, discipline is strict and unrelenting, and pay is meager. Training is relentless and repetitive, and is based on the ancient Russian army tradition of the harder the training, the easier the battle. Soviet conscripts have always eaten a meager and inexpensive diet. Hazing has been going on for a long time. For decades, the Red Army has been conscripted to bring in the harvest. Muslims and conscripts from Central Asia have comprised a substantial portion of the Soviet Army for at least 20 years. While the Soviet Army may have a peacetime morale problem, that does not mean that the Soviet Army would not be an effective fighting force during a war. Laurie does not mention that the Soviet military budget is still in excess of 20% of their gross national product, or that it's growing at a rate of 6 to 8% a year, or that the Soviets still have a 5 million man army and 8 million reserves, or that current Soviet military buildings suggest they still have an offensive strategy and are prepared to use their military forces outside of their borders. The Soviets are still building 1,500 tanks a year when they have an inventory of 63,000 tanks. These new tanks are unnecessary for defensive purposes, but would come in handy if they invaded Europe or the United States. On November 28, 1990, the Soviets launched the Cosmos 2106 spacecraft. It is designed to calibrate anti-ballistic missile radars. Anti-ballistic missile radars are an essential part of the strategic defense system the Soviets are believed to be preparing. This system would make them more confident of launching a first strike. The Soviets are in the process of doubling their inventory of rail-mobile SS-24 missiles and road-mobile SS-25 missiles. These missiles are not needed for deterrence, but they are increasing the Soviets' first strike capability. Soviet conscripts are not manning the strategic rocket forces. If war breaks out, mature officers will launch the rockets that will clear the way for the Red Army's victory. It is a mistake to assume that poor morale would hinder the Red Army's ability to fight. As Baxter points out, while it is undeniably true that military service is unpopular among the masses of Soviet youth, it would be dangerously wrong to equate unpopularity of military service with unwillingness to serve or fight. To begin with, there is the strong and unreserved emotional love of country that is basic to the Russian psyche. As Hendrik Smith observed, in an age grown skeptical of undiluted patriotism, Russians are perhaps the world's most passionate patriots. While Soviet youth by and large do not desire to serve in the Soviet army, patriotism motivates them to do so. Although Russian youth are not militarized in the sense of 18th century Prussia or ancient Sparta, they will fight bravely and well for Russia and against foreigners under the most trying battlefield conditions. The Soviet army, therefore, does not need to build patriotism and discipline among its soldiers. It must merely exploit and nurture what is already there for its own purposes. The notion that the Red Army may be used to restore order in the Soviet Union, but that it is not an external threat, set the stage for the second part of Nightline.
Yevgeny Serov is a journalist with the Soviet press agency Novosti. He has also been an officer with the Soviet Defense Ministry for the past 7 years, and he joins us tonight from our Moscow bureau. Also in our Moscow bureau, David Remnick, the Washington Post correspondent there for the past 3 years. And in our Washington bureau, David Shipler, a former Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times and the author of Russia, Broken Idols, Solemn Dreams. Mr. Serov, the New York Times carries very prominently in tomorrow's edition that the Soviets are going to great lengths to say that there will be continuity in its foreign policy, despite the resignation of Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, that there will be steady support in the Gulf and in Central America. Is there at least the feeling that the rest of the world has the perception the Soviet ship of state is not steady at this point?
Sorry?
Do you understand my question, Mr. Serov? Is there... the New York Times tomorrow carries the story that the Soviet Union is going to great lengths to say that the foreign policy will continue steady, despite the resignation of Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze. Is there a concern the rest of the world feels that the Soviet Union is not following a steady course? Are you worried how the rest of the world perceives what is happening?
I think that the foreign policy wouldn't change despite the fact that Shevardnadze will resign or not.
Is there a feeling that the rest of the world is afraid that your country is not steady at this point, that you are following a course that is not true, that it may be erratic? Mr. Remnick, let me ask you that question. You see where I'm trying to go here. The Soviets seem to be trying very hard to assure the rest of the world that they're going to follow a true course. Are they afraid about how the rest of the world perceives it?
Well, of course they are. And on the day of Shevardnadze's resignation, the Congress immediately passed a resolution saying that the course of foreign policy would be steady. And presumably, President Gorbachev's message to President Bush the other day contained a similar message. On the other hand, we see some ominous signs lately about trying to keep quiet or to tamp down the message of Shevardnadze's warning that dictatorship was coming. And last night, for example, there was a program scheduled on Soviet television that would have given us greater insight into the Shevardnadze resignation, but it was canceled. It was censored, essentially. And there's some great concern about what's going on here and what messages are allowed to go on Soviet television and what not.
Well, one of the things that Shevardnadze warned about, not only that there might be a dictatorship coming, Mr. Remnick, he warned about the boys in colonels' epaulets. Now, does that mean that he had some concerns about what the army might be willing to do?
Well, of course it does, and there's been a battle going on in the Soviet Union between the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry over the course of foreign policy for at least the last 4 or 5 years. The Army, as you know, is extremely concerned about the rapid removal of troops from Eastern Europe and Germany and so on. They're very concerned about their own living conditions. They have some very legitimate concerns as well. And they see the Foreign Ministry and Shevardnadze as having played fast and loose with the concerns, essentially, of empire. And there is the critical debate over power and influence in the course of the Soviet Union.
You hear, Mr. Shipler, that there should be, from those people who are on the right, there should be some kind of order that should be applied. The Army should be used to do that. Can force at this point bring about the kind of order and restoration of forces that they had before that they would like?
The situation has changed tremendously. I'm not sure it's out of control. I think when we analyze this, we have to bear in mind that the Soviet Union has been in a struggle against its own tradition of authoritarianism, and you have really competing political reflexes existing simultaneously side by side. On the one hand, an opening to the West, an infatuation with Western things and Western ideas, a desire to open the political process, move toward decentralized economy on the one hand. On the other, all the old reflexes, which we saw articulated by the head of the KGB a few days ago, fear of the West, a kind of xenophobia, almost a paranoia, a desire for a strong hand at the top, an intolerance for political debate, and for removal of government from every aspect of life. And these two competing, contradictory impulses exist simultaneously. So we're seeing quite a monumental struggle inside that society over which direction they'll go.
But that resignation of Edward Shevardnadze, who has been such a symbol to the West, sent a shiver through everybody. And what David is saying is we're not really sure exactly what is going on, exactly why he resigned, and exactly how strong the threat from the right might be.
I think we can make some deductions about it. Shevardnadze chose a very dramatic way of resigning, doing it in public, warning of an impending dictatorship. He also expressed a good deal of distress about the criticism that was directed at him and his foreign policy, although the foreign policy is really Gorbachev's foreign policy. Criticism from the army and other sources in conservative circles. And it may be a combination of things that's happening. One thing to bear in mind is that leaders such as Shevardnadze, brought up in a closed political system, are not really used to being criticized very much by in public. I know Prime Minister Rizhkov has complained immensely about this, and he threatened to resign many times because of all the criticism he was getting. So this is one aspect of it. Another is, I think, that Shevardnadze seems to be very unhappy with the kind of allies in the hierarchy Gorbachev is surrounding himself with. Gorbachev really has failed to make good use of the Democrats who have come to the surface and been generated by his own policies. People who are liberal, who are westernizers, who want to see something approaching a constitutional democracy created.
Gentlemen, let's just pause right here. It is the end of the year, so I'm going to ask you to put on your prognosticators' hats, as difficult as that may be in such a turbulent situation, and have a look down the road at what changes might be ahead for the Soviet Union when we continue the discussion in just one moment. In Moscow, I have heard some people say that in years to come, we'll look back and see the resignation of Edward Shevardnadze as foreign minister as the end of Soviet reform and the beginning of a new period of law and order. Is that too dramatic a face to put on?
Well, in the short term, no, I don't think it's too dramatic a face to put on it at all. And Gorbachev is a politician with whom it's always the best policy to listen carefully to what he says and not try to read too deeply into his subtext and so on. And it looks as if, especially in the republics, in the Baltics and Transcaucasus, in Moldavia, for example, that you're going to see Gorbachev cracking down. In March, there were declarations of independence from Lithuania and then in the rest of the Baltics. But Gorbachev obviously saw this process of disintegration of the Union as never-ending, and that it was happening in every republic, and he could not put up with that. And certainly the existing institutions, the Communist Party, the KGB, and the military, which after all are the institutions that still have national power, they would certainly not put up with it, and that is the pressure that Gorbachev is feeling. He's feeling that pressure from the right, and that's where power still is in this country.
I noticed there's a claim by members of the People's Congress that his election of the vice president was a kind of, as they called it, a Watergatesky scandal, a Watergate scandal, that the election was actually stolen. Is this a legitimate charge, or is there something to that?
Well, I haven't counted the ballots, and I'm not sure that the interregional group of radical deputies has counted the ballots either. But it gives you a sense of, you know, where Gorbachev's prestige is now, and just how flimsy it is at this point when he's charged with ballot stuffing and all the rest. But this radical or liberal or left faction is now down to less than 300 members, whereas the Soyuz faction, which is conservative, and the Communist Party faction are many times greater. So this is the direction we're seeing in Soviet politics.
If I could just make a comment, I think David makes an excellent point when he points to the Army and the KGB as the only nationwide institutions of power remaining. The Communist Party has really been diminished in stature by Gorbachev, quite intentionally, but I think probably now somewhat to his distress. He has tried to shift political power from the Communist Party to the government. These have been two parallel power structures in the past. And although he's managed to take some power away from the party, the government has proved to be an ineffective tool for conveying political power, partly because government officials always have looked over their shoulder at party people to tell them what to do, and when that authority was removed, you really didn't have a structure that was coherent, and in fact government fragmented throughout the country along republic lines, national, ethnic, regional lines, so that this attempt really has not succeeded, and it's a sad and disappointing failure because it was a real effort, I think, initially at least, to create something approaching a constitutional democratic system in which power really was codified in law rather than just wielded the way the czars used to wield it.
Let me bring this back to the military, is where we started. There is that old communist dictum that power comes from the barrel of a gun, and what, 75% of the military officers are still members of the Communist Party. They have always been loyal to the Communist Party. And if that is not the leading force any longer, and if Mr. Gorbachev's star is falling so rapidly, to whom do they give their loyalties?
Well, this is a very good question. It seems to me that there's been a tradition in the Soviet Union of civilian control over the military, which does not seem about to be abandoned. But there's no question that you've heard increasingly loudly voices in the military of great distress about the way that the country is going. Gorbachev, or any leader, needs the military to hold the Union together. And therefore, I would imagine you'll see increasing reliance on the military in one way or another, and the KGB perhaps.
Are we going to continue, Mr. Remnick, to see that the country spiraling out of control, at least in the near term, while Gorbachev tries to hold on?
Well, sure. I think that's clearly the trend, and what you're seeing is a historic process of a struggle for power. The remaining institutions want to hang on. They want to continue their power. They want the Union to continue. The republics, all bearing their various resentments built up over at least 73 years and possibly into Russian pre-Bolshevik history, are furious, and their anger is pushing them toward independence, and really there is no cohesion here. And Gorbachev is finally being pushed into a sense of cohesion, and his opponents on the left see it as unnatural and authoritarian and possibly, as Shevardnadze said, dictatorial.
Let's pause right here. We'll come back and talk about this coming year in just a moment. Let me ask you for some predictions. Mr. Serov, what do you see in the coming year for the Soviet Union? What will things be like?
First of all, I think that we'll at least decide whether it will be a union in the sense of this word which is existing now. And only great optimists now may say that all the republics, 15 republics, will sign the Union Treaty. And the second great problem for the Soviet Union will be the economy. And I suppose that still for the next year, all the republics will decide to preserve this.
Mr. Serov, let me interrupt you, sir. I've got 30 seconds. Mr. Remnick, quickly, what do you see for the coming year?
Well, I believe greatly in the Russian people's and the Soviet people's ability to slog through. And I think instead of seeing one cataclysm or an explosion, I think we're going to see a lot of separate problems and possibly confrontations in the republics.
Thank you, Mr. Schiffler. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to you, but I thank you all for joining us tonight.
In the interview portion of the program, Forrest Sawyer talked to Yevgeny Surov of the Defense Ministry, David Remnick of the Washington Post, and David Schiffler, formerly with the New York Times. Sawyer immediately got to the heart of the real issue Nightline wanted to discuss. It was not about whether the Soviet Union would hold together for another year or whether the Red Army would crack down on the rebellious Soviet republics. Those are related issues, of course, and have been increasingly discussed in the media. What Sawyer wanted to know was this: would the Soviet Union continue its current foreign policy in the wake of Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze's resignation? Shevardnadze resigned on December 20th, 1990. In an emotional speech to the Congress of People's Deputies, he warned of an impending dictatorship in the Soviet Union. Shevardnadze also rebuked irresponsible boys in colonels' epaulets, that is, the military. Jim Laurie's segment focused on the decline of the Soviet Army and the Soviet Union in general. Why did Sawyer suddenly switch the focus to foreign policy? What does the continuity of Soviet foreign policy have to do with domestic stability in the Soviet Union? The answer is a lot. Western analysts tend to interpret Soviet foreign policy in terms of its domestic policy. Before Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet Union was seen as a repressive, totalitarian state, and therefore as a threat to Western security. This threat was taken seriously in the West. The Soviet Union had a large land army and powerful nuclear forces. When Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, he made a deliberate effort to convince the West that the Soviet Union was no longer a military threat, by convincing the West that the Soviet Union was no longer a totalitarian state. And by and large, he succeeded. What made Gorbachev's gambit work was the notion that the Soviets have undertaken a far-reaching domestic reform. They are, according to his point of view, abandoning communist ideology, restoring individual freedoms, and ushering in a free market economy. Further, it was argued that the dismal state of the Soviet economy forced the Soviets to redirect resources from their military economy to their civilian economy. In fact, the Soviets did just the opposite. On Gorbachev's watch, the Soviet Union increased its military spending and made its armed forces even more powerful than they were. Nevertheless, it is widely accepted in the West that the Cold War is over, that the Soviets have instituted what many hope are irreversible changes, and that the Soviets are perceived to be our ally in Iraq. As I pointed out in my book, The Astrology of the Four Horsemen, the Soviet Union is still providing Iraq with weapons and military advisors. It hasn't stopped. On December 17, 1990, Bill Meridian, a financial analyst now living in Abu Dhabi, the largest of the Emirates of the Persian Gulf, reported that the USSR and Red China continue to supply Iraq through Afghanistan and Iran. On January 8, 1991, ABC News reported that a Soviet ship bound for Jordan was carrying military equipment. It appears that some or all of the military supplies were being shipped to Iraq, although that was denied. Here's the clip.
Still on the subject, there are questions today about whether a Soviet sea captain might be trying to break the embargo on Iraq. A Soviet cargo ship was stopped and boarded 4 days ago in the Red Sea by warships from the U.S. and Spain. Researchers, or should I say searchers, found military cargo, including rocket launchers, tank parts, and communications equipment. The Soviets officially say it's a legitimate cargo bound for Jordan. U.S. officials say most of the cargo appears legitimate, but several crates not listed on the manifest were found in the captain's cabin.
I can assure you that the entire cargo was destined for Iraq. It is unlikely the Soviet captain was acting on his own. Soviet discipline is too strict, and the Soviets have shipped military equipment to Iraq through Jordan before, even after they said they had cut off all military supplies to Iraq. It is now clear that the era of irreversible change is probably at an end. Most experts expect a crackdown on dissent in the near future. On January 8, 1991, ABC News also reported that Soviet troops moved into 7 Soviet republics, supposedly to round up deserters from the Soviet army. Citizens of those republics argued that the troops were really moving in to suppress independence movements in the republics. On January 9, 1991, the Associated Press published a report which gives credence to that argument. The report read, "Armed Kremlin troops surrounded Lithuania's legislative buildings, television tower, and main printing plant today," witnesses said. The government of the secessionist Baltic Republic called on citizens for protection. Hundreds of people responded, massing in the central square in Vilnius, capital of the Republic, the pro-independence news agency ELTA said. The report could not immediately be verified. Baltic officials have expressed fears for weeks that force would be used against their republics, and said the Red Army troops, which the Kremlin said were dispatched to enforce the draft, would be used to quash secession drives. Television and radio stations, as well as newspapers, have been targeted in the past by troops trying to gain control over information. In Latvia last week, Interior Ministry troops took control of the republic's largest printing plant after workers declared it an independent company. The attempt to gain control of the media would be unnecessary if the Soviets were simply trying to round up draft dodgers. Gorbachev did not single-handedly change the perception that the Soviets are not a threat. The Western media, including ABC News, had a major role in fostering that perception. They emphasized Gorbachev's reforms while ignoring his military buildup. Even when his reforms were unsuccessful, they promoted the idea that democracy has come or is coming to the Soviet Union. They did not characterize the use of force in the republics as repression. Now, in the wake of Shevardnadze's announcement, ABC is backpedaling. The return of a Soviet dictatorship means the return of an aggressive and threatening foreign policy. This has caused fear and confusion since Western leaders have based their policies on the emergence of a friendly, democratic Soviet Union. As the New York Times reported, quote, "The resignation of the Soviet Foreign Minister Edward A. Shevardnadze in protest against dictatorship in his country threw Western European security policy into confusion today. For the last year, Western European nations have based their policies on the assumption that support for President Mikhail S. Gorbachev would also help ensure the success of his plans to turn the Soviet Union into a political democracy with a free market economy. The implication of Mr. Shevardnadze's resignation seemed to be that Mr. Gorbachev could fail and be replaced by more authoritarian rulers, or that he could himself abandon a commitment to a greater democracy and freedom. Either way, Western European governments would be left without a coherent framework for their post-Cold War security policy, and their shocked and perplexed reactions today reflected their dismay at the prospect." End of the New York Times quote. The West has, simply put, gone out on a limb. It is decreasing its military readiness in Europe, and most Western nations have given economic aid to the Soviet Union to save Gorbachev and his reforms. On December 12, 1990, George Bush approved up to $1 billion in federally guaranteed loans to allow the Soviet Union to buy food and agricultural products from the United States. The leaders of Western Europe are shocked because they know a totalitarian Soviet Union is likely to be aggressive. Shevardnadze's warning that the Soviet Union might become a dictatorship implies that it is not currently a dictatorship or a totalitarian state. It also implies that the Soviet Union is or is becoming a democracy. The Soviet Union was totalitarian when Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Since then, he has steadily increased his powers so that today he has as much power as Stalin did at the peak of his power. When did the Soviet Union cease being a dictatorship, or at least an oligarchy? It never did. Neither did it stop its military preparations. It simply gave the impression that that's what it was doing, and the West took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Now that it appears that Soviets are likely to use force on the Soviet republics to keep them in line, the specter of totalitarianism reappears. On Nightline, David Remnick pointed out that the Army, the Communist Party, and the KGB, the only institutions in the Soviet Union with national power, will not put up with the independence movements in the republics and will force Gorbachev to crack down. These circumstances were predictable. I would like to read you this account from the Astrology of the Four Horsemen. This is page 89. War or mortal challenges other than war. On February 13, 1988, I talked about the transit of Pluto in close conjunction to the Soviet Union's natal sun at 14 degrees Scorpio and in opposition to the U.S. natal sun at 10 degrees Taurus. I said, Pluto transits of this sort are associated with the outbreak of wars and with mortal challenges other than war. As a result, even if the nations do not go to war, they will face severe challenges. These could include financial problems, nuclear power accidents, power struggles, civil unrest, terrorism, and a challenge to both governments' grip on power. We have seen that the United States has experienced serious financial problems. Thus far, these have not presented a mortal challenge to the current administration or to our form of government, but we have not yet felt the full weight of our economic burdens. Civil unrest and political upheaval have, however, constituted a mortal challenge for the Soviet Union. Were it not for the use of military force and the threat of greater military force, their government would probably have fragmented by now and the top Soviet leaders been deposed. Some observers are concerned that the Soviet Union will become violent in the wake of the changes in Eastern Europe. On April 25, 1990, former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski appeared on Nightline and said, "My prognosis for the Soviet Union is a pessimistic one." He said that the Soviet Union has only three possible futures. One, a belated attempt to reimpose a Soviet empire, possibly with a veneer of communist internationalism. Two, fragmentation. The Soviet Union would simply dissolve and cease to exist as the republics secede. Three, a Romanian-type anti-communist revolution resulting in the overthrow of the government. Brzezinski sees a violent outcome in all three cases, and in all three cases the question is, who will control the Soviet military and especially their nuclear arsenal? French President François Mitterrand recently warned that if Gorbachev's reforms fail, the rise of nationalism threatening the implosion of the Soviet Union will set off a cycle of confrontation and violence which will have grave international repercussions. For your notes, I'm reading now from page 293. The Pluto transit across the Soviet sun concludes in October 1991. Once we get past it, with or without a war, it does not mean that the rest of the century will be peaceful. The Capricorn mega-conjunction of January 1994 is fully capable of igniting war. And at the close of this century and the beginning of the next, we will have three exact Saturn-Uranus squares. The first of these squares will occur on July 17, 1999, when Saturn will be at 15 degrees Taurus, square to Uranus, 15 degrees Aquarius. Not only does this Saturn-Uranus square indicate war, but it also activates the grand square in the combined birth charts of the United States and the Soviet Union, showing that there is the prospect for a major war between the nations during the 18 months before and after July 17, 1999. The other two exact Saturn-Uranus squares will also activate the U.S.-Soviet Grand Square. These will occur on November 14, 1999, when Saturn will be at 13 degrees Taurus, square to Uranus, 13 degrees Aquarius, and on May 13, 2000, when Saturn will be at 20 degrees Taurus, square Uranus at 20 degrees Aquarius. Whether there is a government crackdown, a revolution, or fragmentation, the Soviet Union is likely to be more aggressive towards the West. The underlying dynamics in the Soviet Union remain the same: a failed economy, restive republics, and a strong military. The Soviets cannot revive their economy in the foreseeable future. They are not about to let the empire fragment itself. They need a dramatic infusion of money and technology. If and when the world cannot or will not pay up, the Soviets will be under increasing pressure to use their military to take what they want from Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. like to sing one song for you, to our mighty I Am Presence, with you. And that is my wonderful one, number
462.
Please make your calls to your mighty I Am Presence. Please be seated. Please take out your notebooks. This is our astrology update for the new year. The most recent full moon took place on December 31st, 1990, at 11:35 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Because it was the second in a given month, December, It is called a blue moon. I looked up at the full moon when I returned home after an evening at the conference, and I noted a circle of blue haze around it. I thought of saying once in a blue moon. Blue moons actually occur about every 32 months. The last one was on May 31st, 1988. The next one will be on September 30th, 1993. Since this full moon fell on the new year, it will have some influence on the events of the entire year to come. And that's why we need to take a look at it. The sun was at 9 degrees 50 minutes Capricorn, and the moon was at 9 degrees 50 minutes Cancer. This full moon was unusually powerful. It derived its power from a number of factors. Uranus, the planet of freedom and sudden and explosive change, was at 9 degrees 43 minutes Capricorn, just 7 minutes of arc from an exact conjunction to the sun and an exact opposition to the moon. Neptune was at 14 degrees Capricorn in conjunction with the sun and Uranus and opposed to the moon in Cancer. Mars, transiting at 27 degrees Taurus, was just 1 day away from its direct station. The direct station is the point in a planet's orbit where it ceases its retrograde motion, stops, and prepares to resume direct motion. A planetary station is the point of delivery of the power of a planet. The configuration of the full moon, Uranus and Neptune conjoined while Mars approaches its direct station, is volatile. In its highest expression, it can produce explosive, liberating change, greater political and social freedom, catharsis, a break from the past, an innovative approach to career and family matters. It can also produce freedom from limiting conditions, especially emotional programming that occurred in early childhood. This is because Uranus, the planet of freedom, makes exact aspects to the sun, which represents the father, in Capricorn, which rules limiting conditions and the past, and the moon, which rules the mother and early childhood, in Cancer, which rules mother and home life. I think that all of us experience through this particular conference a tremendous liberation from psychological programming of the past, directly through our parents, our ancestral tree. This was the topic of some of our teaching, as well as the psychology of Zalem on the very same factors, his relationship to father and mother. This is the time when we should heed the Master's instructions to seek resolution in our personal psychology. Serapis Bey called our New Year's conference a conference for inner resolution, and he said, "I have listened well to the study of the psychology of Zalem concerning reincarnation and karma. Study this well, beloved, for some of you, ere you are called to higher octaves, will not have more than this opportunity that you take day by day for resolution. The sands in the hourglass fall for all, yet no man does know in the outer, nor woman, how many grains are above, how many below. Seek resolution so that when you come to our retreat, you will not need to remain 200 years in the lower etheric octave, dealing with those things that can be accomplished by the fiat of your spoken word and your allegiance to the word you have sounded. Believe that your fiat does invoke the full power of the Godhead and accept your freedom, beloved." The December 31 full moon has its challenges and dangers, which are amplified by the Mars direct station. These include political upheaval and the manifestation of revolutionary sentiments, battles. There was a heightened danger of accidents of all kinds over New Year's Day, lingering for about a week. This included danger of airplane crashes, of accidents on or near water, or in and around the home and kitchen. There was also an increased possibility of explosions, fires, and mishaps with machinery and equipment. From December 30, 1990 through the first week of January 1991, the major test was guarding your harmony. There was an increased potential for emotional explosions, emotional ups and downs, anger, arguments, and family stress. You can review that week and grade yourself to see how you dealt with that Mars energy in a certain figuration as it was to the full moon. I would like to also point out that we were asked if we could keep our harmony for the week before New Year's Eve. That was the one question that was put to us early on. And so we had the warning, we had the test, and now you are hearing the astrology. It's very important that we know our astrology, our personal astrology, and our planetary astrology, because it makes the difference when we are warned and forewarned whether or not we will pass those tests and rise into higher spirals of initiation. Now I'd like to tell you about George Bush and Saddam Hussein. Both of them had their natal charts activated by this full moon conjoined Uranus. This configuration was one of two configurations within a period of just over 2 weeks that was to influence their decision-making in relation to war in the Persian Gulf. Saddam Hussein has a Sun-Uranus conjunction in his natal chart. George Bush has an exact Sun-Uranus square. The Sun-Uranus conjunction on the full moon resonates with their natal Saturn-Uranus placings and is likely to influence both leaders to take sudden and unexpected action. Sudden and unexpected action. This full moon is likely to increase or bring to a head some of the conflicts over power, land, and resources that the Church has been involved in. We have the option of liberating ourselves from some of these burdens at this time, if we take it. We also have the option of identifying and defeating hidden enemies, again, if we take the option. Mars made its direct station at 27 degrees Taurus on January 1st, 1991. This released a great reservoir of pent-up energy. It endowed the year with an action-oriented or war-oriented cast. The Mars station increases the potential for anger, aggression, and conflict, both on the world scene and at a personal level. The challenge of Mars is to get into an action-oriented mode, to be practical, and to maintain your harmony. Mars, in its original form, is the point of the white fire and the base chakra of the mother. It is all of the energy of the mother of an entire cosmos. You need to picture yourself riding Mars with reins, and you are in control, just as you see Mother Mary before us with the moon beneath her feet. This is called riding the bull. That way you have all of that Mars energy to implement all of your plans, all of your projects, everything that you have to do. If you allow Mars to break down upon you and unleash the powers of anger of your subconscious and your unconscious, you can have a terrible tossing and tumbling when Mars is coming around aspecting your chart. Remember, it is the power of the Divine Mother. You need to claim it and demand it be stripped of the misqualification of the 12th planet and the fallen ones. We are currently under the influence of the Saturn-Uranus conjunction that took place in Sagittarius in 1988. In the Astrology of the Four Horsemen, I discussed the portents of Saturn-Uranus conjunctions in Sagittarius. This was the fourth Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius since 600 BC. The first marked the collapse of the Greek economy. The second took place between AD 309 and 311 and coincided with a period of bitter persecution of Christians by Diocletian and the joint Roman emperors Constantius and Galerius. This finally ended with Galerius' edict of toleration that legalized the practice of Christianity within the Roman Empire. The third occurred between 1397 and 1399, close to the beginning of the Renaissance. I concluded that based on past history, the 1988 Saturn-Uranus conjunction could be expected to coincide with any of the following: war, economic collapse, religious persecution and/or toleration, and the renewal of culture and learning. To this point, we have experienced religious persecution under the influence of this Saturn-Uranus conjunction. But since this full moon is conjoined Uranus, under its influence we can liberate ourselves from some of the religious persecution that has manifested as struggles with the local, state, and federal government, often at the behest of those who oppose us on strictly religious grounds. What I would like to point out about this Saturn-Uranus conjunction focusing on religious persecution is that it is necessary for everyone to stand up and be counted. And Saturn is the planet of returning karma and testings. And Saturn has brought to everyone who has ever heard of us the opportunity to champion our religious freedom or to persecute us from positions of power. I welcome this in the sense that they must spend themselves. They must perform their physical deeds. As Jesus said to Judas, "What thou doest, do quickly." If you are going to express this persecution, then have done with it and let all of it out so that you can be counted, you can be judged, you can receive your karma, you can learn your lessons, and hopefully in the end be converted to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. If people do not express their internal angers, they seethe there for centuries. So Saturn comes along and triggers the release of these, and they go after us with a vengeance. But that vengeance is the storm that brings the clearing, that brings about then religious freedom and liberation through the judgment of those very forces that persecute. Understanding this cycle, and that this cycle has gone through before, and that liberation followed, we should work very carefully with our decrees for the transmutation of persecution, for the enlightenment of those who persecute, and for the judgment of forces of death and hell who motivate unthinking, unfeeling individuals to join in the battle cry against us. I personally feel that sense of inner resolution by the very process itself. And if you understand Saturn in your chart and in your life, you will welcome initiations, because they are always for resolution, and resolution brings everyone involved to a higher plane. The Uranus-Neptune conjunctions of 1993 are likely to coincide with the end of this period of religious persecution. Uranus and Neptune form conjunctions on February 2nd at 19 degrees Capricorn, and on August 19 and October 24, both at 18 degrees Capricorn in 1993. Conjunctions between Uranus, the planet of freedom and renewal, and Neptune, the planet of mysticism and illumination, occur only once every 172 years. Uranus-Neptune conjunctions coincide with periods of scientific and spiritual progress. They also signal periods of religious freedom, renewal, and innovation. This is likely to come in increments. There is likely to be a several-year period of overlap between the influences of the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, which is associated with religious persecution, and the influences of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, which is associated with religious freedom. During this period of overlap, there will be a clash of values. Saturn represents repressive forces that oppose religious freedom. Uranus represents innovative forces that oppose repression and outmoded ways of doing things. Neptune represents the forces of transcendence and illumination and signifies a climate of widespread acceptance of a mystical path. While the influences of the conjunction of Saturn and Uranus are dominant, the repressive political and social forces of Saturn try to limit and destroy the religious innovation represented by Uranus. But when the influences of Uranus and Neptune are dominant, Saturn begins to give way to the forces of freedom and illumination, but not without a struggle. And these are the reasons why. Circumstances governed by Saturn tend to last a long time. Saturn enters Aquarius on February 6, 1991, and stays there until January 28, 1994. While there, it can have a limiting effect on Uranus-ruled Aquarius. Uranus-Neptune conjunctions can also intensify illusion and social unrest. As I wrote in the Astrology of the Four Horsemen, during this conjunction we could see unstable, treacherous, and potentially violent mass movements transform our own political system and nation. This type of social situation may not be conducive to an immediate revolution of religious freedom. Nevertheless, as we move out of the period of 1993 to 1995, no matter how turbulent, the tide should start to turn in favor of religious freedom if it has not already done so. On January 15, 1991, there will be an eclipse of the sun at 4:49 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This will be an annular eclipse, one where a ring of sunlight is visible around the disk of the moon. A solar eclipse always takes place on the new moon. This eclipse takes place at 25 degrees Capricorn, thus the sun and moon are at 25 degrees Capricorn. An eclipse can be either good or bad. It can activate a positive cycle in the life of an individual or a nation. It can eclipse difficulties or troubling circumstances. Or it can signal the onset of serious challenges. Saturn at 27 degrees Capricorn makes a close conjunction to the eclipse. Since Saturn is in Capricorn, the sign of its rulership, its influence is exceptionally strong. Saturn rules prudence, caution, and responsibility, crystallization, and long-term planning, pessimism, obstacles, and limitation. In mundane astrology, the astrology of nations, Saturn rules the state and its institutions, political power and parties, corporate executives and heavy industry, repressive regimes, the elderly, and order and stability. In its highest expression, Saturn is associated with profound wisdom. Saturn is the tester, whether in the guise of Christ or Antichrist. One thing is certain: Saturn will always test you, and it will test you through personal and planetary karma. The solar eclipse of January 15, conjoined Saturn in Capricorn, signals the activation of another karmic cycle, for better or for worse. It can signal the descent of positive or negative karma. It can also neutralize or signal the eclipse of a long-term cycle of limitation or repression due to karma. The acute effects of the eclipse may be seen within a few days on either side of the eclipse. Its influence may last for 6 months or longer. During the period of influence, transiting planets will form aspects with the eclipse point. These can activate the most volatile energies of the eclipse. You should have 2 goals regarding this eclipse. First, be practical and prudent. Be poised and organized, and carefully plan for your long-term victory. Second, don't fall into a state of gloom and doom. Watch out for depression and steer clear through the minefield of self-criticism, self-condemnation, and self-judgment. Don't limit yourself. We will see a growing sense of pessimism, despair, and despondency throughout the world. That momentum has been upon us this entire year. Don't identify it as your own. Every once in a while, when I tend to identify with the depression or the despair or the despondency of the world that I am carrying, I forget that it's not my own. And so I say to Almoria, "Why do I feel depressed?" And he will say to me, "You are not depressed. You are bearing the weight of world depression." I'm no different from you. I'm also a Chela. You need to remember that when you feel down at any time, to recognize that millions of people are entering an era of real depression. Economic depression, personal depression, depression from the descent of their karma, depression because they see no light at the end of the tunnel for themselves. They're without jobs, their children are dying all over the world. There is misery. Millions and millions of people are carrying this energy. So we, the light bearers, have to recognize that this is the sign and the call of this particular eclipse, and it's going to be felt a long time. The eclipse of the sun at 25 degrees Capricorn activates the charts of key nations, leaders, and institutions. It takes place on January 15th, the deadline the United Nations has given Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. This solar eclipse at 25 degrees Capricorn activates Saddam Hussein's natal T-square, Jupiter at 26 degrees Capricorn, opposed to Pluto at 26 degrees Cancer, square to Venus at 21 degrees Aries. As I pointed out in the astrology of the Four Horsemen, this T-square shows Saddam's ruthlessness and his tendency to engage in large-scale power struggles and to take everybody else with him. A Pluto-Jupiter opposition can also indicate widespread death and destruction. On July 21, 1990, Saddam mobilized his forces for his invasion of Kuwait. This same T-square was activated by the eclipse of the sun at 29 degrees Cancer. He marched his forces into Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, just 4 days before the eclipse of the moon on August 6th, 1990. This lunar eclipse at 13 degrees Aquarius activated the ascendant of his solar chart at 14 degrees Leo and his Sun-Uranus conjunction at 7 and 9 degrees Taurus. The eclipse of the Sun on January 15, 1991 at 25 degrees Capricorn will be followed by an eclipse of the Moon on January 29, 1991 at 9 degrees Leo. This eclipse forms an exact square to Saturn's natal Uranus at 9 degrees Taurus and a close square to his Sun at 7 degrees Taurus. If Saturn's past behavior is a guide to the future, we can expect an unpredictable and shrewd use of force. An unpredictable and shrewd use of force. These eclipses do not necessarily show military action, but it is certainly a possibility, including the potential for a surprise attack by or against Saddam. A coup or some other sudden action is also possible. The conjunction of Saturn to the eclipse may limit the onset of whatever action is contemplated, including aggression, but if so, only for a time. The eclipse of the Sun on January 15 at 25 degrees Capricorn forms a square to George Bush's natal Saturn at 25 degrees Libra. This is an aspect of responsibility and accountability. Bush has domestic as well as international challenges to deal with. This aspect of responsibility and accountability that configures in George Bush's chart is clearly the karma of the United States of America. Our karma is upon us in this particular configuration in the Middle East. And this astrology confirms only what the masters have told me. So Bush has domestic as well as international challenges to deal with. The square shows that the president is in danger, political and perhaps physical danger to the president and to the United States will increase as transiting Uranus, now at 9 degrees Capricorn, makes its exact opposition to Bush's natal Pluto at 11 degrees Cancer on January 28, 1991. Political and physical danger will also increase as Uranus makes its exact oppositions to the United States conceptional Sun at 13 degrees Cancer on March 15, May 23, and December 25, 1991. In Chapter 20 of the Astrology of the Four Horsemen, Uranus the Great Awakener, I pointed out that this Uranus transit could spark civil unrest, violence, and strikes in the United States, political fragmentation and social upheaval, and even revolution. I also pointed out that this will be a major turning point for the president. In extreme circumstances, he could be driven from office, or he could ride the Uranus transit to great popularity. This is the first section of the astrology update, and I will be out briefly with the next section of it. I would like you to give violet flame now for the transmutation of the negative portents that I have given you. Thank you.
Mighty cosmic light, my own, I am present, I proclaim freedom everywhere in order, and I don't know, I am making all things whole. Mighty cosmic light, stop the lawless order, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and justice and in service to, I am coming unto you. Mighty cosmic light, I am all surveilling, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and magnifying all the will, I am reading living still. Mighty cosmic light, now make all things, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and those which we also go, I am the wisdom also know. I am freedom's holy light, and nevermore despairing. I am freedom's holy light, evermore I'm sharing. Freedom, 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 expand, expand, expand. I am, forevermore, I am freedom. Mighty cosmic light, my own, I am present, I proclaim freedom everywhere, in order and I got to go, I am making all things whole. Mighty cosmic light, stop the lawless order, I proclaim freedom everywhere, in justice and in service to, I am coming unto you. Mighty cosmic light, I am long prevailing, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and magnifying all the will, I am freedom living still. Mighty cosmic light, now make all things, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and those which we also go, I am the wisdom also know. I am freedom's holy light, evermore despairing. I am freedom's holy light, evermore I'm sharing. Freedom, 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 expand, expand, expand. I am, forevermore, I am freedom. Mighty cosmic light, my own, I am present, I proclaim freedom everywhere, in order and like I control, I am making all things whole. Mighty cosmic light, stop the lawless order, I proclaim freedom everywhere, and lion, lion, motivating, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and magnifying, never will, lion, freedom never still. Mighty golden lion, coming, golden, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and love is the king, go, I am the wisdom of the know. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is buried. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is buried. Freedom, 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 expanding, expanding, and I am evermore, I am freedom. Mighty golden lion, present, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and all the red, every soul, I am making all this soul. Mighty golden lion, soul, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and love is evermore, I am coming down to you. Mighty golden lion, I am love, making, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and magnifying, over will, I am freedom every soul. Mighty golden lion, coming, golden, contemplating, freedom everywhere, and love is I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. Freedom, 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 expanding, expanding, and I am evermore, I am freedom. Mighty God, I am present, representing freedom everywhere, and all the rest of the I am making all soul. Mighty God, I am self, all the golden, representing freedom everywhere, and all the seven, seven, two, I am coming unto you. Mighty God, I am representing, freedom everywhere, and magnifying, all the will, I am freedom every soul. Mighty God, I am coming, golden, representing freedom everywhere, and all the seven, seven, I am the wisdom of the know. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. Freedom, 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 expanding, expanding, and I am evermore, I am freedom. Mighty God, I am present, representing freedom everywhere, and all the rest of the I am making all soul. Mighty God, I am self, all the representing freedom everywhere, and all the seven, seven, two, I am coming down to you. Mighty God, I am representing freedom everywhere, and magnifying, all the will, I am freedom every soul. Mighty God, I am coming, golden, representing freedom everywhere, and all the city, all the go, I am the wisdom of the know. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. Freedom, 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 expanding, and I am evermore, I am freedom. Mighty God, I am present, representing freedom everywhere, and all the rest of the I am making all soul. Mighty God, I am self, all the representing freedom everywhere, and all the seven, seven, two, I am coming unto you. Mighty God, I am representing freedom everywhere, and magnifying all the will, I am freedom every soul. Mighty God, I am having all the representing freedom everywhere, and all the seven, I am the wisdom of the know. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. I am freedom, holy lion, evermore is bearing. Freedom, 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 expanding, and I am evermore, I am freedom.
Please take out your notebooks. In addition to the threat of war in the Persian Gulf, the President is going to face growing problems in the domestic economy. The solar eclipse at 25 degrees Capricorn conjoins Saturn at 27 degrees Capricorn, falls close to the United States conceptional Pluto at 27 degrees Capricorn in the nation's second house of money and finance. This indicates that the nation will get more economic bad news. The recession is likely to grow worse, and there is an increased likelihood of bankruptcies and bank failures. The government will probably be under pressure to do something, and that something may take the form of placing repressive controls on some part of the economy, possibly as an effort to forestall a panic. The solar eclipse at 25 degrees Capricorn also opposes the Federal Reserve System's Neptune at 27 degrees Cancer. This shows that any measures the Fed takes to stabilize the economy are likely to be ineffective, confused, or to have unpredictable results. The Fed is moving into the era of its demise. What is likely to happen to the price of gold in 1991? Wouldn't we all like to know? There are conflicting indicators, which means that the price of gold is likely to be volatile. We are now in a recession which, by all indicators, is growing worse. Financial analyst Robert Kwasny says that under normal circumstances, the price of gold usually falls significantly during a recession or depression. Kwasny is aware that these are anything but normal circumstances. He says that if there is a war in the Persian Gulf, the price of gold will go through the roof. On January 7, 1991, for example, the price of gold jumped about $9 an ounce on the futures market, as war in the Persian Gulf seemed more likely. Kwasny says that if the war lasts for any period of time, gold will stay high because people run to gold in times of crisis. Gold is likely to stay high if the price of oil stays high, and that is almost a certainty if there is prolonged conflict in the Gulf. Continued instability in the Soviet Union, particularly in the gold mining regions, could also drive up the price of gold. Arch Crawford, an astroeconomist, says that there are two cycles that should push up the price of gold in the near future. Crawford says that when Saturn enters Aquarius on February 6, 1991, it should cause the price of gold to rise. When Saturn, which can have a depressing effect, entered Leo, which rules gold, some 14 years ago, it coincided with the IMF gold sales, which drove down the price of gold. Now, as Saturn enters Aquarius, he says the reverse is likely to happen. In addition, Crawford says that as Mars, the planet which energizes, reaches the late degrees of Cancer and then enters Leo in the end of May 1991, the price of gold should rise again. I would like to point out to you that it's Bob Kwasny and Arch Crawford who are making these predictions, and not myself. The United States economy is sensitive to the winds of war in the Persian Gulf. On January 9th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 40 points during the day, based on hopes for peace between the United States and Iraq. When it became clear that the meeting between U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz was a failure, the Dow plunged 80 points. When it closed, the Dow was down 39 points for the day. Also, on the 9th, the price of oil rose $7 in 10 minutes based on war fears. If the price rises because of war while the United States is in a recession, the United States will almost certainly have unusually serious economic problems, and the Soviets will reap a windfall. I'm reading to you again from the Astrology of the Four Horsemen, page 377. Suppose for a moment that the Soviet Union did help Iraq plan its invasion of Kuwait. Why would they do it? One obvious answer is that whether Iraq wins, is utterly annihilated by the United States, or breaks even, Moscow makes a fortune. Here's why. The Soviet Union is the world's biggest exporter of energy. As Edward J. Epstein writes, the Soviet Union exports 3.3 million barrels of crude oil a day, about the same as Saudi Arabia, and in addition sells Europe almost an equivalent amount of natural gas, the price of which is contractually tied to the price of a barrel of oil. It has also been quietly negotiating a deal under which Japan would develop gas fields in eastern Siberia and build a pipeline across the Sakhalin Peninsula to the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. If the crisis goes on for a year or so, Japan reasonably can be expected to sign up for Soviet gas. There have been a number of reports in the media about how the Soviets cannot really take advantage of the rising price of oil because its production is declining. While Soviet oil production is going down, it will decrease about 5% this year. The Soviet Union pumps 12 million barrels a day and is still the world's biggest oil producer. Thus, despite the decline in production, the rising oil price gives the Soviets fantastic windfall profits. Experts differ in their estimates, but the Soviets make an additional $1 billion to $2 billion per year for every dollar increase in the price of a barrel of oil. Oil was about $16 a barrel before the invasion. It is almost $40 a barrel as of this writing. The World Bank says that it could go to $65 a barrel if war breaks out. Other estimates go as high as $100 a barrel. If oil goes from $16 to $66 a barrel and the Soviets make $1 billion per year for each dollar increase in the price of a barrel of oil, then the Soviets will make an additional $50 billion a year. That's not counting their extra income from natural gas sales to Europe and from the high price of gold, another major Soviet export commodity. The price of gold increased more than $50 an ounce following the invasion. The longer and hotter the conflict is in the Persian Gulf, the richer the Soviets will become. On the other hand, the United States loses money every day the crisis continues. The U.S. is the world's largest importer of energy. As Epstein points out, each dollar increase in the price per barrel of oil drains more than $2 billion a year from the U.S. economy. If oil stays at $40 or $50 a barrel for any length of time, let alone at $65 or $100 a barrel, it could trigger a deep depression in the United States. I think that your books of the Astrology of the Four Horsemen ought to be dog-eared from your reading them again and again, because in here you discover the exact keys as to what calls you should be making in your inserts. If you don't make precise calls, you will not get precise answers. The infusion of cash that the Soviet Union can expect from war in the Persian Gulf will by no means be enough to solve their economic problems. The eclipse of the sun at 25 degrees at 25 degrees Capricorn, conjoined Saturn at 27 degrees Capricorn, is conjoined the Soviet Union's progressed Sun at 28 degrees Capricorn and its progressed 7th house cusp at 26 degrees Capricorn. This is likely to deliver another blow to the Soviet Union's economy and government. The current government may fall, be reorganized, or use force to reestablish law, order, and tradition throughout the empire. The eclipse on the 7th house cusp shows a hardening of relations with foreign countries and the Soviet republics. If other influences are present, this could be an indication of aggression. This is a bad time for any nation to sign agreements with the Soviet Union. The potential for negative consequences is present in the extreme. In November 1990, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a treaty on the reduction of conventional forces in Europe. Now the Bush administration is concerned that the Soviets are not keeping their end of the bargain. In the report that you are about to see, ABC News reported the following: that the Bush administration says that the Soviets are providing the United States with inaccurate data on conventional forces. The Soviets may have far more military equipment in Europe than they are allowed under the treaty, and they are also violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the treaty. Can you believe that this is finally on the news? I attribute it to our cyclopedias, the Cyclopedia Marathon, and I encourage us to keep it up because it has exposed this entire situation and forced the news to carry it. And what is being carried on the news is but the tip of the iceberg. Here are examples. The Soviets transferred 3 divisions from the Army to the Navy rather than deactivating them. They simply changed their uniforms. They moved military equipment out of Europe, east of the Ural Mountains, rather than destroying it, as the treaty said that they would. As a result of Soviet dishonesty, the Bush administration is considering canceling a summit meeting to sign a strategic arms reduction treaty. Now, it's not really a result of Soviet dishonesty. It's a result of the president being in a position where he is forced to allow the media to carry what he has known for a long time and has denied. The president did not just come across this information. He has this information. Remember, he was once head of the CIA. If the reporters for ABC News were on their toes, they would have reported that the Soviets have violated the spirit and the letter of all of their arms control treaties with the United States, including the much-praised INF Treaty. Let's take a look at this clip.
From the White House today, word that President Bush might postpone his upcoming summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. They are scheduled to meet next month in Moscow to sign a major arms control treaty, but all is not well. Not only with that treaty, but with another one that was supposed to be all wrapped up. Here's ABC's David Ensor.
When Presidents Bush and Gorbachev signed the treaty cutting conventional arms in Europe last November, it was hailed as the result of a new era of trust between the superpowers. But now senior administration officials admit they are worried by what they call grossly inaccurate data supplied by the Soviets on how many tanks, planes, and other military equipment they have in Europe.
There are what we call serious discrepancies of data and questions of interpretation.
The Soviets have also moved tens of thousands of weapons east of the Ural Mountains, technically out of Europe. That doesn't violate the letter of the treaty, but it violates the spirit, which was to destroy weapons, not to move them. They have also declared that 3 Soviet Army divisions are now part of the Navy and therefore not covered by the treaty. Unless the dispute is resolved, some officials say the Senate may not ratify the Conventional Weapons Treaty or any treaty with the Soviet Union. What scares them is the possibility that the Soviet military could be acting on its own.
A lot of the concern is whether or not we are dealing with one Soviet government, whether independent ministries running their own games, primarily the defense ministry, whether or not Gorbachev and the foreign ministry can get the defense ministry back in line.
The Soviets have until February 17th to correct their data on troops and military equipment. Officials say unless Gorbachev can get honest numbers from his military, the newfound trust between Moscow and Washington could be damaged. David Ensor, ABC News, the State Department.
When are the American people going to wake up and say the Soviets aren't playing fair? And we're not going to play their game any longer. We've got to say it for them, and we've got to say it in our decrees, and we've got to say it by learning the facts and taking them out to the people ourselves. through this entire astrology update, you identify areas where the Soviets are vulnerable and where we can move through with our decrees, with our 705s, and all that we have to make this outcome be the very best it can be for the children of God on this planet in every nation. Soviet intrigue and deception is not limited to their arms control treaties. As I said earlier, the Soviets are giving Iraq military and intelligence support and supplying Iraq with military equipment. Yet the Soviets said they would cut off all arms shipments to Iraq following its August 2nd, 1990 invasion of Kuwait. This Soviet deception is just what I warned of in the Astrology of the Four Horsemen. I demonstrated that the Soviet presence in Iraq is far greater than the American media portrays it. Again, I'm reading to you from page 377. The composite picture of Soviet military assistance to Iraq is that the Iraqi army is very nearly a clone of the Soviet army. Iraq's army was organized and trained by Soviet advisors. It is now led by Soviet advisors. It also uses Soviet weapons and tactics and is guided by Soviet intelligence. If fighting breaks out between the United States and Iraq, American soldiers will die fighting a Soviet-cloned army. Even worse, American soldiers are likely to be killed by Soviet advisors, and Soviet advisors are likely to be killed by American soldiers. That's a sobering thought. Direct confrontation between U.S. and Soviet forces is the stuff world wars are made of. At the very least, it gives a new meaning to terms like U.S.-Soviet cooperation and unity. In my book, I also noted that there were a number of astrological configurations that show that things are not what they seem in terms of U.S. intervention in Kuwait. These configurations show treachery, intrigue, and confusion, and that something dangerous is going on beneath the surface. This again requires cyclopeas. I warned that there is an astrological link between the events now unfolding in the Middle East and a potential future confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. I described 3 grand squares in the charts of Saddam Hussein, the United States, and the Soviet Union, which link the national identities of the U.S., the USSR, and Iraq with the planets of mass death and destruction, Pluto, unpredictable events, Uranus, and war, Mars. I wrote, these grand squares show that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait will affect both the United States and the Soviet Union and could be a fuse for U.S.-Soviet conflict. The news for January 9, 1991 is somber. It focused on the failure of Secretary of State James Baker and Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to reach any agreement in their effort to avoid war. The pessimism expressed following the meeting is indicative of the influences of the eclipse of the Sun in Capricorn conjoined Saturn. It also shows these world leaders in the grips of what appears to be fate, but is really the outpicturing of karma. Let us look at this clip of tonight's news.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, I heard nothing today that, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever on complying with the United Nations Security Council resolutions.
We had grave or big differences about the issues we addressed.
War or peace? I can't misrepresent this to the American people. I am discouraged.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
It has not been a good day in so many nations today, but nowhere more so than here. There was a deeply felt anticipation that maybe when the Secretary of State and the Iraqi Foreign Minister had finished their conversations in Geneva, the dimension of the Middle East crisis would somehow be diminished, that the emphasis would be on a political solution. When the two men talked for 6.5 hours, there was a real flurry of optimism, but it was all wishful thinking. The U.S. and Iraq are one day closer to war. We begin in Geneva with our national security correspondent, John McCarthy.
From the moment they sat down this morning, it was a grim and uncompromising conversation. Secretary Baker and Foreign Minister Aziz admitted there was no apparent progress toward a peaceful settlement and no new ideas were introduced by either side. Each man acknowledged that time is running out and the possibility of war appears to be growing. When it was over, each man presented his case.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, I heard nothing today that, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever on complying with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. There have been too many Iraqi miscalculations.
I made it clear to him that we have not made miscalculations. We are very well aware of the situation.
Baker said he found Iraq's rationale for invading Kuwait less than convincing.
I heard, for instance, that their action in invading Kuwait was defensive in nature, that they were being threatened by Kuwait. And I will tell you the same thing I told the minister, which is I find it very hard to believe.
Instead of discussing a withdrawal from Kuwait, Aziz argued that there could be no settlement of the Gulf crisis without a settlement of the Palestinian problem first. He accused the U.S. of using a double standard and not forcing Israel out of the territories it occupies.
But when it comes to the Arabs, there you raise the stick. And we are fed up with this policy of double standards.
I don't think many people believe that Iraq invaded Kuwait in order to help the Palestinians. And if they did, it was another miscalculation because it hadn't helped the Palestinians. I think most people believe that Iraq invaded Kuwait for Iraq's own aggrandizement.
On the possibility of war, Baker laid out in detail what will happen if Iraq does not withdraw.
Iraq will be choosing a military confrontation which it cannot win and which will have devastating consequences. Don't miscalculate the resolve of the American people, who are very slow to anger, but who believe strongly in principle.
Iraq will defend itself in a very bold manner. We are a courageous nation.
Aziz was asked if Iraq would attack Israel if a war starts.
Yes, absolutely yes.
Aziz claimed Iraq would not be the first to attack anybody. When presented with the letter from President Bush for Saddam Hussein, Aziz read it carefully, then refused to accept it, saying President Bush used inappropriate language for communicating with the Iraqi president. The only issue about which Baker got some cooperation today was on shutting down the American embassy in Baghdad.
We have asked for and received assurances for our remaining 5 diplomatic personnel to leave on the 12th of January.
The embassy is closing down, American officials say, because the U.S. is clearing the decks for a war that both men say their leaders want desperately to avoid. Yet today, after so many hours of talks, the lines in the sand seem to be drawn deeper. Peter?
John, the Secretary today described himself as somber. In his entourage, is there any belief that the political process can be resurrected?
One way to interpret this, Peter, is that the U.S. is playing the bad cop and that other people might be able to play the good cop. In other words, after the stern message from the United States, perhaps Saddam Hussein will be convinced that if he does not do what the U.S. is asking, perhaps through some other channel, that there will be a war. That's what the U.S. is banking on now, another channel.
Okay, John, thanks very much. In a moment, we'll talk about another channel. President Bush said today that he believes Saddam Hussein still does not understand how much force may be used against him. I think Saddam Hussein feels, said the president, that he would prevail. And said the president, he's wrong. At the White House, Britt Hume.
After conferring with Secretary of State Baker by phone and watching Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz on television, the president did not hide his dismay.
This was a total stiff arm. This was a total rebuff. I watched much of the Aziz press conference. There was no discussion of withdrawal from Kuwait. The United Nations resolutions are about the aggression against Kuwait. They are about the invasion of Kuwait.
The president strongly denied that his rejected letter to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, which the Iraqi embassy here also spurned, was rude or inappropriate.
I've been around the diplomatic track for a long time. The letter was proper, it was direct, and it was what I think would have been helpful to him to show him the resolve of the rest of the world, certainly of the coalition.
The president said he worries that Saddam doesn't recognize that the coalition will use its formidable force against him. And he held out only slim hope others, such as the UN Secretary General, can sway the Iraqi leader.
I'd have to level with the American people. Nothing I saw today, nothing, leads me to believe that this man is going to be reasonable, that he'll come around. But we ought to keep trying. We ought to keep trying right down to the wire.
There is real disappointment here tonight that today's talks produced no breakthrough. But there is still hope that the Baker mission might have accomplished its more modest original goals, helping sway American public opinion toward the view that President Bush is at least seeking a peaceful solution, and helping convince Saddam Hussein that the coalition arrayed against him means business. Peter?
Britt, one of your colleagues at that news conference today asked the president why he was in a hurry to get on with war. Are those the vibes you get from Mr. Bush?
Well, not exactly, Peter, but it's understandable that some might. He's in the position of trying to create two somewhat paradoxical images. To the American public and to the coalition partners, he wants to seem a man of reason and of peace, but to Saddam Hussein, in order to get him to get out of Kuwait, he wants to seem a man of war. It's not hard to understand why some might get the two images confused.
Okay, Britt Hume at the White House, thank you very much. Some of my colleagues are still waiting on the line, including ABC's Ted Koppel, who's in Geneva tonight to do Nightline. As you know, Ted, there was a suggestion from both delegations today that the UN Secretary General might yet go to Baghdad, but do you think we're looking at the end of the diplomatic process?
No, I don't think we are, Peter, and I think, first of all, we have to take a look at that January 15th deadline and see it for what it is. It is not a day upon which war is necessarily going to begin. In fact, I think we'd all be tremendously surprised if the war did begin on the 15th or the 16th, or even during the immediate days thereafter. Nor is January 15th a date on which the diplomatic process, for any reason, has to end. There are, as we've already indicated, and as our colleagues have indicated on this program, there are a number of diplomatic initiatives that you've already spoken of, not the least of them being that by the UN Secretary General. The French government has made it quite clear that it is going to push its own diplomatic initiatives. There are others in the European community who'll be pushing them, and within the Arab world who'll be pushing them. So I think that what has really happened today is that the United States has pushed as hard as it can the notion that it, at least, has done everything it can. It is prepared to go to war. It is now waiting, of course, for Congress to, in effect, sanctify what the UN Security Council has already done and give the president its approval for going to war if necessary. So all the ducks are in a row, but I think between now and then, the diplomatic process still has a chance.
Ted, we all know that the press is not always the best barometer of things. Here today, there's a real deep mood of pessimism as a result of all this. What about in Geneva?
Well, I can understand that, Peter, because you and I have been talking to one another since early this morning, Geneva time, and the fact of the matter is, when we began this day, it looked very grim. When we looked at those two delegations, the Iraqi and the American, confronting one another across the table, it looked very grim. But then as each of those 6.5 hours passed, we began to believe that surely after so much time, something would emerge, something positive. So I have to tell you that the mood here in Geneva tonight is certainly not optimistic. I was simply responding to your question. I don't think the diplomatic process is dead.
Okay, Ted, thanks very much. Let's move on to London, where ABC's Pierre Salinger has been actually monitoring the French initiative for some period of time. Pierre, the French seem very ready to go on with diplomacy now, almost vigorously ready, but what makes them think they could succeed where the U.S. appears to be failing?
Well, Peter, as a matter of fact, since the end of the meeting in Geneva, they have become quite pessimistic about their diplomatic initiative, which they're going to launch tomorrow. They had hoped that perhaps they could get something done before the evening of January 15th. But I am hearing a word from the Élysée Palace, which is the French White House, that after what they've seen, what happened in Geneva today, they are less optimistic about what they can accomplish. In any case, though, they're going to try to send their foreign minister, Roland Dumas, to Baghdad, but they're not the only ones who are going to try. The European community still wants to have a meeting with Tariq Aziz, even though Tariq Aziz said that he would not meet them in Algiers. They may also have to go to Baghdad. The Swiss foreign minister has sent private notes to both Tariq Aziz and James Baker, saying that he's ready to mediate between them.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. So let's move finally back to Geneva, where ABC's Barry Dunsmore has been listening to the Iraqis and the Secretary of State today. Barry, at the end of this very long day, you just cannot miss the enormous difference in priorities Mr. Baker and Mr. Aziz appear to have for the Middle East. What's the clue to us understanding the foreign minister from Iraq today?
Well, Peter, we begin with the premise that Tariq Aziz was going to be self-serving to justify what may be considered unjustifiable. But when he begins to talk about the double standard that the West holds against the Arabs, he's certainly going to strike a responsive chord with millions of Arabs, and it's not just over the Israeli issue. For many centuries, the Arabs have been treated like third-class citizens and have been told by the colonial powers, do what we say, not what we do. And so when he was able to stand up there speaking good English and explain quietly the exposition of the Arab position, he was probably making a lot of very good points and probably making a lot of Arabs feel that he had a very definite point to make. Now, this may not be particularly good, it may not solve anything, but it probably won't do any harm either for that to have been said.
Okay, Barry Dunsmore in Geneva, and my other colleagues as well, thank you. In a moment, the Congress makes final preparations for its debate about war.
What appears to me as the X factor in this war that some believe is inevitable is the Soviet Union and their involvement. How will they involve themselves? How much will they enter in on the side of Iraq? Shevardnadze has said that sending Soviet troops on the side of the U.S. in the Middle East is absolutely unthinkable. There's no way that would ever happen. He said that some weeks ago. They are still arming Iraq. Their advisors are still there. One of their top military men is the architect of Iraq's entire force, as you can read about in my book. So once the war begins, how will they move? Will they move to reinforce? Will they take it as the opportunity to prolong the war for their economic gain? It's a totally unpredictable situation. And what President Bush is not telling us, which we have as fact and which I've published, are the statistics as to just how much equipment of a Soviet nature is in the hands of the best trained Iraqis, and how many advisors will be flying with them in their planes when they come to this confrontation, if it ever comes. President Bush must have an awful lot more knowledge than he's telling us. I believe that cyclopedias should bring this to the attention of the American people. And I believe we should continue to pray for all light bearers in the Middle East of every nation, race, or religious background, because it is always the light bearers who are the object of every war and every attack. It is truly a sobering situation and a somber one, and inasmuch as the diplomats of foreign nations have said that they stand with the United States, that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait, I cannot understand what diplomatic maneuvers or ovations are going to bring back a better response than was given today, and including bringing in the entire Palestinian question. We heard the chilling words that if there is a war, Iraq will most definitely strike Israel. Israel is fully prepared and definitely ready to strike the Arab world in its self-defense. We know this, and we can see a tremendous conflict ensuing from all of these corners. The eclipse of the Sun on January 15 at 25 degrees Capricorn, conjoined Saturn at 27 degrees Capricorn, signals a turning point for Church Universal and Triumphant. It can eclipse and bring to a close some of our power struggles with local, state, and federal government officials and agencies. It could end some legal matters and conflicts over lands and resources and who has the power to control them. This does not mean, however, the immediate end of legal difficulties or power struggles. The events that lead to the end of these conflicts and struggles could include a flare-up of legal activity and threats from the government. The eclipse in its negative expression can indicate a renewed and sustained attempt by government forces to eclipse the church. In essence, the eclipse gives us an opportunity to eclipse the government opposition manifesting as their legal and legislative initiatives. If we fail to meet this challenge, we will face a difficult, long-term threat from legal and government maneuvers designed to exhaust our own resources. Keepers of the flame, let's accept the challenge. Let's mark the signs in the heavens. Let's get to our court and let's do the labors and see to it that we have an absolute victory as we ride the crest of this distinct possibility of this eclipse of the sun, which happens to fall directly, almost within the hour, on Tatiana's birth chart. And so that gives us the momentum with that eclipse of her causal body and all of the light bearers who are a part of this movement. I believe that we must have this victory. There is no alternative to victory. We've scored a tremendous victory already with Judge Rabcook's decision to allow the dismissal of the state's demand for an injunction against us. They have dug in their heels to determine to challenge that, and now is the time to go after it with this tremendous thrust of the new year that we've had at our conference, that we have now in this astrology. We have to turn everything in our favor. We have to play karate with astrology. Whatever comes our way, we have to turn it back. We have excellent decrees for that purpose, an excellent spirit for us, and truly the profound confidence that from the beginning we were winning. Thank you. I would like to remind you that it's very important for us to decree for and to defend our book, The Astrology of the Four Horsemen. There is great opposition to it. It needs to get out there and be in people's hands before they forget they ever believed in Glasnost and wonder what's new about our book, because our book is right on with exactly what's going on. So it has a timetable of its maximum impact, and that timetable is right now. I ask you to always insert the opposition to that book, The Dweller on the Threshold Opposing It, into your calls. When I ask for calls, you really should be pulling out a notebook and just thumbing through your notebooks and rattling off those calls. That is why you take notes, so that you have all of that in your hip pocket when you need it.